a long journey. I'll talk about it at two levels. One, how the journey of history has been traversed around the world, particularly the kind of dominant history writing, historiography that we have inherited from Europe. What kind of journey it has traversed, how it has mainly how it has expanded into various kinds of domains. Expansion of the theme, expansion of the discipline is one aspect that I'll be talking about very, very briefly, naturally. And the second is the changes that were brought in, the internal dynamics of the discipline, the changes that were brought into it over the not years and centuries, but and decades and centuries, but over something like a millennium, more than a millennium and a half. So that, and the second I would be talking about, if possible, if I have the time, to talk about how history writing or his study of history has changed in India, has evolved in India in the past, whatever time frame that one can think of, one can take up. So, okay, well, to begin with, when one talks of history, one is talking of a discipline. One immediately thinks of it as a discipline. That's, we are all formally engaged in the study of history in the BA level, at the BA level, at the MA level, postgraduate research, etc., and teaching of history at that level. So history for us is a discipline like all other disciplines, like physics and chemistry and economics and sociology and so on and so forth, But what was it really a discipline? Was it always a discipline? We always go back to Herodotus as the sort of originator of history, as it were. That's what we have assumed, that he was the originator, though one can raise doubts about it. But the histories, the title of his book, Histories, although the title of the book is Histories, it's not history, but histories, The title of the book itself gives you an idea of what history meant to Herodotus and his contemporaries in the 6th century BC. And he says, he mentions that what he's writing is tales and traditions. So tales and traditions in the plural, histories. This is what history meant for him, or it meant histories rather than history. So it's not a single discipline, and that history really meant for him a collection of tales and traditions. The tales and traditions, once you collect tales and traditions, it really implies that there need not be any attempt to prove the authenticity of these tales and traditions and so on and so forth. There is no proof of it. There is no attempt to verify. There is no proof for the authenticity. In fact, the very idea of authenticity of these becomes irrelevant in a way. So that this is how history began. So A, it was plural. B, it was unproven, unchecked. And B, it didn't have any explanation, as it were. There is no causal explanation involved in these tales and traditions that Herodotus and others bestowed upon us. So that there is no explanation involved virtually. There are, of course, it's occurrence of this event and that event that's recorded, but why those events occurred, what is the rationale of those events, how do we know whether these occurred or not? None of these is a question that is relevant to Herodotus's histories, or not the discipline of history, but the subject of history in his time. And that's long way of 6th century BC, about 2,700 years ago. But gradually, one major intervention occurred in the evolution of the discipline that was in the medieval European context. The medieval European context, particularly Saint Augustine, he was a major shaper, as it were, of history as it has come to us. And his intervention was twofold intervention. One, that history is a unitary, uh, it's a one single whole. It's not the history of this region, history of that region, history of India, history of China, history of Europe, etc., etc. It's one single whole. He's not talking of world history really. He's talking of history as one single whole, one single unit. History is not divided into different parts, regions or periods or whatever. History is history as a single unit. The singularity of it is very important. Its importance I'll dwell upon a little later again. So let's hold on to the notion that history is a single narration. It has a singularity of its own, unitary character of history. That's one intervention that he made, decisive intervention. So the diversity of history that we had been heir to since Herodotus, that got dispensed with and gave rise to one single narrative by a unitary history rather than history in its diversity. That's one. The second, which is also connected with the first, is that history got a causation. History got an causal explanation in the medieval centuries in Europe. And the causal explanation that was given particularly by Saint Augustine was in his book, The City of God. For him, city is the universe, the whole world is city. So it's the whole universe or whole world, if you like, is the city of God. That's a single entity. And this intervention, the explanation, causal explanation that he gave was that everything that has occurred in the past, is occurring today, has one single explanation, namely God's will. Everything happens according to God's will. Nothing happens in the world. Nothing has happened in the world. Nothing happens in the world without God's will involved in it. Without God having ordered, as it were, God having willed it to happen. So that God's will became the explanation for all events of the whole world. So that you have a double alteration here. One is that diversified history, the diverse history becomes one's unitary narrative and the single narrative, and the other is that that one single explanation was given to all of history, the universal history. Now, I mentioned earlier that it has a much greater significance than merely, it's merely that it's a historical phenomenon that occurred in the medieval period. Because this phenomenon of history as a unitary entity and with a single explanation, this has survived into not only into the modern period, not only in the work of and thinking and philosophy and thinking about history of the most outstanding thinkers of Europe, and it has survived in the thinking of not only the most outstanding thinkers of Europe, but it has survived in the thinking of thinkers who were dead set against any kind of theology or religion and so on and so forth. What kind of history historical explanation that we get from Hegel, for example, and particularly from Marx, for example. The explanation that we get is all of the history is a single unit, single entity, and in Hegel, it is one single explanation, that's world spirit. History is governed by a single world spirit. But particularly in Marx, all history is the history of class struggle. So all history is a single entity. He did divide by this all history. They really meant, Marx and Engels really meant European history, but they talked about all history as a single unit, universal history as a single unit. In which Asia became the exception. That's a different story. It's a bit of an absurd kind of exception, but that's a different story. But all history then as a single entity, and all history having one single explanation. This was the intervention that St. Augustine made, others also, but St. Augustine made. And this is the intervention that has survived in the thinking of the most advanced thinkers like Hegel and Marx. And it has survived in the thinking of, as the basic premise of these thinkers, of their concept of history. It has survived in the thinking of people like Marx, this assumption of theology, all history being one single unit and being driven by one single explanatory cause. This has survived in the thinking of people like Karl Marx, who is the most almost virulent opponent of any kind of theological assumption. So such is the power that Saint Augustine lent history, that it survived for a long time after he was gone, and after the medieval age itself had gone. So there was a basic alteration that occurred in the kind of early history or ancient history or history of antiquity that we had inherited. So there is a fundamental alteration of that in the medieval period. Now, still in the medieval period, God, of course, was the cause of everything that happened. Oh, let me also add that what is the assumption of Saint Augustine in suggesting that all history is a single unit, and that there is a single explanation. Once you accept that God is the cause of all occurrences, historical occurrences, God is omniscient. He knows what has happened in the past. He knows what is happening now. He knows what will happen in the next year and 2 years and 20 years and 2000 years or whatever in the future. So he knows the past, the present, and the future entirely. And since everything is happening according to his will, therefore all of it forms one single unit, one single pattern, one single unit. To us, they all appear haphazard events, but to God, they are part of a pattern that is unfolding by and by as God's will unfolds itself. So that there is a logic to making history as a single unit and giving one single explanation, historical explanation, which logic survives right and up to our times. Not in the late 20th and early 21st century, and not until then, but right up to almost till the middle of the 20th century. So anyway, so we have this one single explanation, one single unit, and one single explanation of history. Yet there is still the idea of verifying the authenticity of narration, authenticity of events that were described. That idea of authenticity still doesn't occur through the medieval period. Uh, Nobody seeks to nobody seeks to check whether the events that so and so are described are right or wrong, true or false, etc. The idea itself, as I said, doesn't occur. Well, this idea of checking the events, veracity of the events or the narration of the narrative, began to arise sometime in the 16th century onwards, roughly 16th century onwards. When two things happened. One is that Europe had so far had at one time the Roman law, which was a highly organized sort of system, uh, legal system. But then it gave way. Roman Empire gave way, and Europe got sort of divided, and so on and so forth. Each small territory became its own unit, its own entity, and so on and so forth. So Roman law began to give way, not began to give way, it gave way completely. And there was no substitute for this Roman law. Uh, what came in place of Roman law was customary law. Each unit, each unit of territory, or each, in fact, subunits in each territory, they had their own customary law, which is not fixed, which is not definite, which is quite sort of open to not only interpretations but implementations in different kinds of ways. It's almost like our khap panchayats. Each khap has its own sort of customary law, or caste panchayat. So that customary law had been operating throughout the Middle Ages in Europe until about 16th century, 15th, 16th century, post-Renaissance. Roman law began to be revived, and Roman law, any legal system, highly organized legal system, would require interpretation of the law, constant interpretation of the law, and therefore it would require going into the history of that law, each law, so that a critical attitude towards first Roman law, beginning with Roman law, then into the history of each law, and then into the discipline, or what was to develop as a discipline of history. So an critical attitude towards history began to evolve. And the second was the development of language. The meaning of each word began to be questioned, or rather investigated, and it's sort of different meanings, and one could see that each word had a different meaning. So a kind of critical attitude towards narration of historical events began to develop. And a second development that took place was from the 16th century, but particularly in the 17th century, was that archives began to be formed. Family archives, regional archives, state archives, etc., etc. These began to be established. And once you have archives, then it's so easy to go and check the authenticity of veracity of an event. So that the various combinations gave rise to a critical attitude towards not only the historical events that were narrated, but also the archive, also the very evidence. First, the idea of evidence came up, and secondly, the idea of critical evaluation of the evidence itself. The evidence that we have, how authentic is the evidence? What is the origin of that evidence? who is the author of that evidence, what were the motivations of the author, and so on and so forth. Critical evaluation of evidence began to develop particularly in the 17th century. And the sources that we deal with, sources, primary sources and secondary sources, the definition of primary sources that we have and secondary sources that we deal with. Primary sources are those which are closest to the event that they are narrating, and secondary sources are those which are compiled much later. So that this definition of sources and this distinction between primary sources and secondary sources came to established in the 17th century. So that now a discipline was beginning to evolve in Europe, beginning to evolve, not yet established. I'll take a quick jump, and come to the 19th century, because 19th century is what really gave shape to the discipline of history as we know it. 19th century, particularly Leopold von Ranke, he was the decisive figure. All of these take time to evolve, but there is some figure or the other who gives it a concrete shape. And Leopold von Ranke was the one who gave the discipline a concrete shape early in the 19th century. In 19th century, universities also departments of history began to be established in universities, particularly in Berlin University. But more than that, he gave this formula, wonderful formula, about 7 words in English, 5 words, I'm told, in German. History tells us as it really happened. This is his formula. History tells us as it really happened. This formula actually he wrote in a preface to a book, not in the book itself, but that 7 words in English or 5 words in German became the sort of hallmark of the discipline of history as given to us by von Ranke. Ranke was really emphasizing as it really, there were 2 emphases here. One emphasis was that it's history which tells us as it really happened, not the historian. Historian can be wrong. Historian evidence may be partial. His understanding may be faulty. So it's not the historian, or even historians put together don't tell us as it really happened. History tells us as it really happened. How does history tell us as it really happened? History tells us as it really happened because the task of the historian, according to him, was to go on collecting all the facts of history. All the facts of history from the archives. Sure. All the facts of history that are, gathered together in the archives, from, as I mentioned, family archives to state archives to they became national archives and so on and so forth. So go on collecting facts of history. And one day when all the facts will have been collected, then history will tell us as it really happened. So the first emphasis is on history as history, not the historian. History tells us, history in its totality will tell us what really happened. And the second emphasis is what really happened. That's even a greater emphasis, that there is an objective truth, objective reality hidden in these archives, in these documents. We have to go on unearthing this truth, accumulating this truth. Cumulatively, it will come to a stage when all the facts will have been collected. Then don't judge these facts. Don't sit in judgment of these facts. Don't generalize from these facts. Don't arrive at a meaning or generalization of these facts or interpretation of these facts. Just collect the facts, And one day, when all the facts will have been collected, history will tell us as it really happened, So there is there is an objective truth hidden in these facts, which will come to us as we unearth these facts bit by bit, by and by. So that the notion of one single truth, which is unambiguous, which is about which no doubt can be raised, this notion of one single truth embedded in history, this came to us with Ranke. So this notion of one objective truth, which will get revealed by and by, ultimately, this has come to us from, so history as the, which also made a distinction between history and mythology. History is what tells you the truth. Mythology, in fact, mythology has a very, very one particular problem. Mythology, or myth as we call it, myth and reality. Myth by itself means fiction. So there is a contrast between history and mythology, history and myth. History is the truth, objective truth. Myth is fiction. Which is a very unfortunate distinction that has been made, because that has come to evolve and still goes on, because it's an unfortunate distinction, because myth also is a kind of history, a kind of history. Myth doesn't tell us about the events. I mean, it narrates events, etc. But these are not the historical events. But myth tells us about the values of a society, often changing values. As the myths change, the values, or the depiction, they depict the changing values of a society. The religiosity, the extent of religiosity in a society, or acceptance or rejection or resistance to these values, or this religion, or whatever. So that's also a kind of history. But there are two interrelated disciplines, history and mythology. They are interrelated rather than antagonistic, but we have for long built upon the antagonism between history and mythology. But anyway, so Ranke gave us this notion of history as the truth, single truth. This prevailed throughout the 19th century, and it wasn't confined to Europe, to Germany or Europe. It got extended to the rest of the world. As Europe expanded to the rest of the world, it's not only its arms and its trade and its political system and its exploitation extended to the rest of the world, but even its intellectual concepts also got extended to the rest of the world, including the concept of history, including the notion of tripartite division of historical time, ancient, medieval, and modern. By the end of the 19th century, the whole world had this notion of this European notion, or European division of time, and European notion of the objective truth, which in India, the tripartite division was first used in 1903. By end of the 19th century, it was all over. So that this notion of objective truth came to us, and the notion of use of archives to establish the truth came to us from Ranke and from Europe. And it got accepted everywhere, including the periodization of history. Now, one underlying assumption of this notion of truth and use of archives as for finding the truth was that, what are the kinds of descriptions or narratives stored in the archives, usually about kings and queens and princes and battles and administration and so on and so forth, or high-ranking nobles and noble families, or so on and so forth, even if it is family archives, it's usually the archives of such, high-ranking families. So that the history that came to us necessarily from these archives was the history of kings and queens and battles and administration and nobles and their intrigues and so on and so forth. History came to be confined to that. Throughout the world, history came to be confined to that. By 20th century, questions began to be raised about both the single truth and the notion of the single truth, objective truth, and history began to expand way beyond the court and its precincts and so on and so forth. So that there is a great 20th century began to expand. There is the history is not only kings and queens and their battles. History of agriculture, for example. Agriculture expands or contracts and how it affects societies in their time. The expansion of agriculture in Europe, for example, in the 12th, 13th century. And what was the expansion? From a sealed yield ratio of 1:3. It 1:3 at the most. It grew to 1:4 or 1:4.5. That is to say, if you sow, let's say 10 kilograms of seed, you get 30 kilograms as yield. Of these 10 kilograms, you have to preserve as future sealed again. So you have 20 kilograms for consumption in any year. Now, let us imagine that, not imagine, that's how it happened. It grew to 1:4 or more than slightly more than that. But let's assume that it was 1:4. So as a result of this agricultural growth from 1:3 to 1:4, the amount of food grain available to you nearly instead of two grains or 20 kilograms of food, you have now 30 kilograms of food, 50% rise of food grains available. That means population is bound to grow. That means population is also bound to grow differentially, in the sense that stratification with the population. Some will grow richer than others, some will get poorer than others. So differentiation is, so it has multiple effects. Migrations begin to take place as a result. It has multiple. What about the history of agriculture? That doesn't come from the archives. What about history of industry, crafts, industry, trade? And gradually, what about the history of the family? So, all of these new themes began to emerge in Europe in the 20th century. Absolutely new themes began to emerge. And also as a result, databases began to expand, not merely archives, documents preserved in the archives or text preserved in the archives, but documents of every kind. Documents for a history of the agriculture. You not only have to go to understand the techniques of production, technology of production, instruments of production, but also the mindset of these farmers who are going in for increasing their values, their own culture, and so on and so forth. So different kinds of sources began to be used. As Lucien Febvre put it, text, yes, but all kinds of texts, and not texts alone. This was the expansion. Use text, but all kinds of text, and not text alone. You have to go beyond text. You have to go to the field, as it were. Mark Bloch spent about 20 years, not at one go, but over his life, 20 years in rural France, in order to understand the cultural legacies that have survived from the past, which explain to him the medieval past. So that you have to different kinds of sources, and gradually even other kinds of themes. The history of rain, for example, the history of forests, for example, and so on and so forth. Ecology came into being. The question of women came into being. So it greatly began to expand, and the databases began to expand exponentially. Almost every, what the French called the I think wrongly translated total history. It's actually history in its entirety. Everything comprises history. Everything comes to let you understand history. So the vast expansion began to take place, and therefore the causal explanation also began to get diluted from one single explanation. Everything has its own explanation. Every major event has its own explanation rather than one single explanation. One single explanation was given to us. I mentioned earlier Marx, for example. All history is a history of class struggle. Not all events occur as a result of class struggle. There are many other explanations of. My favorite example is the creation of Bangladesh. Bangladesh didn't come into being for reasons of economic exploitation or political subordination. All of these were there, but it came into being because of the resentment against the subordination of the language, Bangla language. It was uh, a cultural causal explanation rather than. So it's never a single explanation. It's always a combination. But sometimes the economy, sometimes politics, sometimes values, sometimes culture. Each has its own conjuncture. Each great event has its own conjuncture in which causal explanation, the hierarchy of causal explanation undergoes a change. So that by now the notion of a single truth has been given up. Surely, we all know that. The notion that there is not a single explanation, that has been given up for sure. We know, and in fact, there are some theoretical insights which even go to the question, even question the very notion of truth, any truth in history, in that each historical construction is a kind of mobilization of power, one power or the other, one kind of power or the other power. Let me give you a quick example from our own home. When the dispute in Ayodhya began to arise, well, it was an old dispute from 19th century onwards. It began to arise. Many historians, including from JNU, had contested the notion, the idea that a Babri Masjid was constructed on the site of a Ram temple. This was, in terms of historical evidence, etc., etc., it was contested. But there was another, that was one kind of attempt to mobilize social power in favor of what we thought was historical truth, namely that no temple was demolished, no Ram temple was demolished, or no temple was demolished to construct the Babri Masjid. Which, by the way, is a conclusion that Supreme Court has also come to. Supreme Court has, in its judgment, they have said that no temple was demolished to construct Babri Masjid. In fact, the Supreme Court held that demolition of Babri Masjid was a criminal act, and L.K. Advani and company, they should be tried for this criminal act, etc., etc. We know what happened. But there was this truth of a historian's truth, which sought to mobilize popular support or social power, if you like, to establish that no temple was demolished. which is historical truth, which has the Supreme Court accepted. But there is another truth which was mobilized, or rather another mobilization that took place, was that there was a temple that was demolished by Babar. It was this, that, that, other, etc., etc. So in the end, two kind of mobilizations of two kinds of truths truths within court began to be mobilized. One, the historical truth in terms of historical evidence. The other is a social kind of socially accepted truth that there was a demolition of a temple, etc., etc., which actually began to grow in the 19th century. Prior to the 19th century, there is no such truth being accepted in society, but from 19th century onwards, it began to accept it. And in the 1980s, Advani ji mobilized this truth of social power, and ultimately they won in not in the anyways in the Supreme Court also, although Supreme Court didn't accept the idea that a temple was demolished, but they gave the land to Ram Mandir anyway. So I'm mentioning this because various kinds of history then is in this view, history doesn't tell you the truth. History is a form of mobilization of social power, and therefore each version of history is a mobilization of social power. The success of one mobilization does not prove the truth of that mobilization. It just means the success of the mobilization of power, see, rather than the truth of that power. So that notion of truth itself, the truth that Franke had given us, that notion of truth itself has been modified now. So it becomes various kinds of truths, not in the sense of objective truth, but in the sense of mobilization of social power. Each truth is a mobilization of social power. And therefore, all these truths are constantly in contest with each other. See, they are constantly in competition with each other, and therefore there is a constant kind of tension in society over one truth or the other truth, and so on and so forth. So that much of a good part of it is absurdity, that there is no truth in history. That's some of the postmodernist thinkers like Hayden White and many others think. But history is, in the end, it is based on historical facts. It is based on evidence. It is based on logic. That one in which logic with which one understands history. This is how history can't be. It's not a figment of imagination. History is not like a novel that you write. History has a certain discipline. The discipline of evidence, the discipline of critical evaluation of evidence, and the discipline of critical evaluation of the inferences drawn from this. So it's absurd to say that history is mere construction. But that's how we have come to, that's how we have very long distance Europe has covered, from Herodotus down to Hayden White, if you like. And lots of expansion has taken place, lots of transformations have taken place, and lots of and now we have, if I may sum it up, now we have come to a stage of, we have from certitude. Ranke and Marx and etc. gave you a certitude. There is a truth, the truth hidden there. You have to unearth that. There was a certainty about that truth. From that certitude, we have moved to the arena of ambiguities. There are many kinds of truths, not in the sense in which Hayden White describes, but in the sense that there are many perceptions of the truth, and that many understandings of the truth, and these understandings have to be are constantly in competition with each other, in tension with each other. Now, that's very quickly the European part. Let me very quickly try to outline the Indian part. But India itself has had a long tradition of not history writing, but perceptions of the past. In ancient India, what we call ancient India, uh, a certain kind of perceptions of the, not history in the sense of chronological history and so on and so forth, but in the sense of perceptions of the past uh, uh, prevailed. And many studies of this have been made, most recently by magnificent study by Romila Thapar, the past before us. But medieval, when we come to medieval, we do have a certain given tradition of history. In fact, the notion of archives came to India, was established in India by Akbar, for example. He established an archives for allowing, for facilitating Abul Fazl to write his Akbarnama, to give him information. So, but the history writing that was given to us in medieval India had a certain degree of authenticity, in the sense that the attempt to verify the narrative of events was already there throughout, whenever, as far as you go, medieval India. One reason why one says that is that there is a strong element of chronology in these medieval histories. Every event that is described is given a certain date. In this year, the very narrative is this. In this year, this event happened, and that event is described. And then we should say, and another event that happened in this year is this, and so on and so forth. So every event has a narrative. I'm sorry, every event has a chronology attached to it. And chronology is a very good way of establishing the authenticity of an event. Which is not to say that all events that have been described are authentic, in the sense that we accept them as it is. We never give up our critical evaluation of these. But there is an element of authenticating events in terms of the chronological sequence to which these are assigned. Anyway, but mainly the history that came to us was from James Mill, which we practiced right up to the 1950s, actually. The James Mill kind of Hindu period, Muslim period, British period. The basic assumption of it, premise of it, was that in the Hindu period, the Hindu religion was the explanation, was the driving force of events or history. And the Muslim period, Islam was the driving force of history. And now in the British period, there will be a more modern kind of, more civilized kind of history that was written. He had utter contempt for Islam, but he had even more contempt for Hinduism, and because he was a utilitarian. So he really he gave a new twist to this ancient, medieval, and modern, and the twist was, it was not ancient, medieval, and modern which came to us, but Hindu, Muslim, and British which came to us, that he gave us. The equivalence here is that, in the ancient, medieval, and modern for Europe that was developed in the 17th century, modern was the rational. Modern was equivalent to the rational. Medieval was the irrational, superstitious, backward, static, bad in a way. How medieval it is. It's very derogatory term. In India, that was one kind of distortion of history, by calling a whole period a period of dark age, as they said. But it got further distorted when it came to India. The backward medieval became equivalent of Muslim period, so that Muslim became the Muslim period, and the Muslim itself became the equivalent of backward and regressive and oppressive and so on and so forth. So but that's how it lasted till about the 1950s. Even when the nomenclature changed to ancient, medieval, modern, the basis remained the same. But that was the colonial kind of paradigm. And this is how history as a discipline came to us also mainly in the 20th century, starting a little earlier, started by colonial historians themselves. 1817 is the date of the British history of British India by James Mill. But it became a discipline in the 20th century, mainly thanks to the great work of Sajjanwa Sarkar and Sardesai and so on and so forth. So that history comes as a discipline to us from within the same framework that James Mill had given us, and continued to be so right till the almost till independence. After independence, we all know how enormously history writing in India has expanded to many areas. It's fascinating. I'm an old man now. I've had my time, but I'm fascinated by the kind of themes that young people are taking up. Fantastic themes, absolutely brilliant kind of themes that they are taking up. Not only the history of ecology and feminist history and so on and so forth, but migrations, for example, history of waters, for example, migrations are a fascinating new theme which is catching up everywhere. Migrations have occurred since for the last maybe 10,000 years, maybe more than 10,000, 15,000 years, who knows, But the tracking of these migrations through DNA testing, purely scientific testing, the tracking of these migrations is taking place now around the world, including in India. It's a fascinating theme that is taking place. So that the decolonization that has taken place is in India. Decolonization has taken place through the expansion of giving up of that silly kind of Hindu period, Muslim period, British period, but taking up new themes which don't get constrained to these kinds of periodization. In fact, the themes which don't get constrained to any kind of periodization. In fact, the notion of periodization itself is under very great strain now around the world, including in India. I recently was reading this book, fascinating book by Dipesh Chakravarti, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. What a fascinating theme. It's not the history of the world. It's not the history of India or China or Europe or Latin America. It's not the history of even of the history of the world. It's the history of the planet. It's what can be a more it's not even the history of the globe, and it's the history of the planet. What can be more universal, a kind of universal history than the history of the climate around the world, and the history of migrations around the world, and the history of the planet itself, and so on and so forth. So that absolutely brilliant new themes are arising with magnificent new kinds of methods of analyzing history, including DNA, of which I don't understand virtually anything, but I understand that it's a very major kind of intervention, scientific intervention. So the new themes that are absolutely taken up, new kinds of databases that are being used for it, and new kinds of methods that are being employed for it, that makes history a very lively discipline, very fascinating, lively discipline. This is, I'm sure it's true of all disciplines, but since I am in the history sphere, arena, I'm fascinated by the kinds of experimentations that are taking place in the ideas. And let me conclude by, on a sad note, that, in the midst of all these fascinating experimentations that are taking place, we are being forcibly driven back, as Dr. Ashwini Shankar had mentioned while talking about the webinar today. We are being, or implied, we are being forced back to just history. What is history? History is Hindu versus Muslim, Muslim oppression of Hindus. Go back to James Mill, the kind of history that we have left behind 50 years, not 50, 60, 70 years ago. We are being forced back into that kind of history, almost, driven down our throats into, don't talk of anything, talk only of Muslim oppression and Hindu resistance to it. So you have to be, luckily, I must say, the discipline of history is not taking up this kind of, the discipline of history as practiced by students and teachers and historians, the discipline of history is not succumbing to, it has gone way beyond that kind of James Mill kind of history, way, way beyond. And it can't really be forced back into it. But then their idea is not to change the historian's mind. Their idea is to change the, voting people's mind, voters' mind, so that their votes can be caught. It doesn't matter what history they are taught or they learn or they imbibe. But that's a sad note. But on the other hand, let me not end on a sad note. Let me repeat that history as a discipline is very, very, very wild, almost wildly live, very, very thriving discipline, which is expanding and developing in areas that people of my generation had never thought of. So it's wonderful, great compliment to young generation. I hope some of you who are listening to, some of you undergraduate students who are listening to it, I hope some of you will take it even further. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, friends, for this rambling kind of talk. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank